Hey everybody, hope y'all are having a fantastic week. Now that we're starting our new lesson series, going through the book of Joshua, we're going to see some interesting things, some things that may be familiar, some things that you've never heard from the book of Joshua. And so we're going to look at those today and over the next several weeks. We'll probably be in this study for a couple months. But as we look and as we think and as we pray about this, we're going to see God telling Joshua many times. You see this theme throughout the book of Joshua is be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. You also see time and time again where the Israelites trust in God, then they trust in themselves. Then whenever they trust in themselves, they end up being defeated. And we're going to see that throughout as well. So, but before we start that lesson and actually get into the book of Joshua, I thought that it would be a good idea for us to review kind of how we got to this point, how the nation of Israel got to this point. So our lessons this week is going to kind of be a bridge lesson. I'm calling it from Egypt to the Promised Land. And so we're kind of going to look at the path that the children of Israel took from the moment that they left, from the moment of the Exodus from Egypt, to when they arrived in the Promised Land, when they arrived at the border, preparing to go in. So that's going to take us right up to Joshua. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we're going to look at we're going to see some interesting things that I think, that God has for us as we look at this lesson. So, how did they get to the Exodus? Let's talk about this. How did the Israelites end up leaving from Egypt? So, we see this, and we've probably heard this 100 times, and some of you may have heard it a lot, some of you may never have heard it. So, we see the Exodus in that the thing that really kind of pushed the nation of Egypt over the edge was the plagues. Moses came in to Pharaoh and told him to let his people go, to let the Israelites go, to go and worship their God, to go and live by themselves, to no longer be slaves. And they became slaves because, remember, we talked about in our previous study, we talked about Joseph being sold into slavery in Egypt. And then his family, there was a famine in land, and all his family ended up coming to Egypt. Well, the Israelites got strong, and the Pharaoh worried that they would overtake them and defeat them. And so pretty much he made them slaves. He made them build bricks and other things for the nation of Egypt. But we get to the point where we see the plagues, and we see the plagues departing and what's going on. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at these plagues real quick and see how, it kind of affected the Egyptians more. So what we're going to do is the first passage we're going to read, we're just going to read several passages today, is Exodus chapter 12, verse 33 to 36. That's Exodus 12, verse 33 to 36. And this is after the plagues happened, after all the plagues had happened. We'll look at those here in a second. But we see that the Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, "We shall all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks and on their shoulders. The people of Israel had also done as Moses had told him, for they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold, jewelry, and for clothing. And the Lord had given people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. So we see here that, God provided for his people. And God provides, and that's kind of going to be a theme that we're going to see throughout this lesson and throughout the next lesson as well, because I believe we're going to be doing this one in two parts. So as we look and as we think about it, let's just take a quick look at the plagues. So the first plague was turning the water of the rivers in the water into blood. Now, this was a direct attack on the Egyptians, because number one, the Egyptians worshipped the Nile. The Nile was the life that was very vital to everything in the Egyptian region. Because you got to remember, if you go to Egypt or you look at pictures of Egypt, it's a lot of desert. And so this was the main source of water for them. And so they turning it into blood. And this was an attack on the Egyptian god Hapi, which was the god of the Nile and a water bearer. And so we'll see that typically the plagues corresponded to one of the gods that they worshipped. So the second plague was frogs from the Nile. Frogs from the Nile. Now, This wasn't just one or two frogs that you may see crossing the road or in your backyard or something. This was a plague of frogs. So think of like thousands and millions and billions of frogs coming up out of the river. So this was an attack on Heket, the Egyptian goddess, who was of fertility, water, renewal. And this goddess actually had the head of a frog. And then we have, the plague of lice and gnats. I don't know if you've ever gone outside and you've had a lot of gnats that were flying around, but, kind of walking into them, it's kind of annoying to do that. But then, they eventually dissipate. But yet, just imagine that being like a solid wall of gnats that just got in there and just were bugging you, and you could barely move without them getting in your face, in your mouth, wherever you were going. It's just not pleasant to think about. And so, this was attack on Geb, who was the god of the earth for the Egyptians. And remember that Moses threw the dust up in the air from the ground, and they became the gnats and the lice. And next was the swarm of flies. So if gnats and lice weren't enough, we have the swarm of flies coming in. And flies come in and they destroy, they carry disease, they do all those things on that. And so, this was an attack on Khepri, which had the head of a fly and was the god of creation, and the god of the movement of the sun. Because remember, the plague was so thick with people, with flies, that it blocked the sun. And so, that's interesting there as well. I'm sorry, I find this stuff interesting. I hope you do as well, because if you look at people like the Egyptians and other peoples, they have gods for everything. And we'll be looking at some of that as well as we get into the people that are in the promised land that Israel is told to drive out. We'll look at some of their gods as well, and the reasons why that God told them to drive them out and to destroy them was because of their gods and the influence that would have on them. So next we see is the death of cattle and livestock. This was an attack on Hathor. This god had the head of a cow, or this god's head of a cow, and it was the goddess of love and protection. So it was an attack on her. And then we see the next is that the ashes were turned into boils and sores. So people ended up getting boils and sores all over their body, that they were itching and things like this. This was an attack on Isis, which is the goddess of medicine and peace. And so this, once again, each plague was an attack on the god. And as we get to the point, we see next ones, they're going to be gods they revered more and more highly than others. So then we see the next was hail from in the form of fire fell from heaven. I don't know if you remember, or if you were on this past Saturday, but whenever I was on the way home from our Easter egg hunt, we were on the way home and we were hitting in Ashburn, and it just started hailing. I mean, it was about pea size. But yet, whenever I grew up in Texas, before we left Texas, we had softball-sized hail that was falling from the sky. Well, just imagine not only hail, but it's fire. Hail does a lot of damage because of the amount of, force that can be behind it, the larger it gets. But just imagine it falling with fire. So fire and hail coming down, doing damage to the earth, doing damage to houses. That was an attack on Nut, who was the goddess of the sky. And then we see locusts. Now, locusts, were come in, and whenever there's plagues of locusts, and we see this throughout the Bible, is there was times whenever they would come in, they would destroy crops. And they would do all these different things. And so they would destroy crops and things like that. And that's what this was an attack on. Nephar and Nephi were the god and goddess of grain. They were the ones who provided the food for the Egyptians, for the food for bread, for all these things. They provided all these things for them. And it was an attack on them because the locusts came and destroyed the grain, destroyed the crops, destroyed all these things that these gods were supposed to provide for them and protect them from. And then we see the plague of darkness. Probably one of the most popular gods, and probably ones you may have heard of, is Ra. Ra is the sun god. He's in charge of the sun, and he was the mightiest and revered god, the second mightiest and revered god after Pharaoh. Because the pharaohs were considered a god to the Egyptians. And then the final plague, the death of the firstborn, and then that affecting Pharaoh's house and Pharaoh's firstborn being died. It attacks Pharaoh, who was the god over Egypt. And it's kind of interesting how that last plague was attacking the death of the firstborn. Whenever earlier, and we see this in Exodus 1, when the Pharaoh who was of the land at that time decided that they were going to slaughter all the babies of the children of Israel. And so we see this, coming back and it coming back on him in the end of the verse. Even though it wasn't him who was the one who ordered it, it was the Pharaoh who ordered it. So we see that, and finally, after all of that, Pharaoh decides to let the people go. Moses continued to ask and beg and plead after every single plague to let his people go. And we see, and if you read through the story, you'll see that his heart was hardened. He hardened his heart. He didn't want to give in. He didn't want to give in. He didn't want to give in. One point he gave in, but then he stopped and decided and changed his mind. And so we see that he decides to let them go. And then we come to our next passage, our next kind of journey on this way, our stop on this way to the promised land from Egypt. We're going to see the Red Sea. Red Sea. And so, once again, you've probably heard this, many times. They came to the point and they were out there and God told them to go camp somewhere and they camped there. And then Pharaoh changed his mind. He realized, why are we letting these people go? They're our slaves. We need them. So he sent his army after them to bring them back and to scare them. And then they get to the point where they stop trusting God. They've seen God do all these plagues that most of them didn't affect them. They were affecting just the Egyptians. They'd seen God change to where God allowed them to go. They'd seen that God allowed them to take money and food and clothes and all these things from these people so they can provide for themselves. But yet they still feared for God. And that's a theme that we see as well in this study that we're going to see this week and next week. So we see that they come to the Red Sea crossing. We're going to read Exodus chapter 14, verses 13 to 14. And Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have to only be silent." So the people of Israel, they come, they're freaking out. They come to Moses, they say, "Well, why did you pull us out of Moses? You should have just left us to die in Egypt. We had at least had graves to be buried in there. But now we're stuck in the middle of the desert in the Red Sea, and we can't escape from Pharaoh." Once again, they had just been seeing some miracles that had happened. But yet, God tells Moses and Moses tells the people to stand still. Just let God's going to deliver us. And we see God do a mighty miracle where he parted the Red Sea and they went across on dry land. And then they go across, and so the pillar of flame and the cloud was blocking the Egyptians from getting to them. And so once that cleared off and they got across, Pharaoh sent the army of the Egyptians into the sea to follow after them. Well, God, at that point, put the Red Sea back to normal, and the Egyptians drowned. So God provided a way for escape for the people. God provided a way of escape. And so then we see this time and time again, once again, where they've seen these miracles. They've seen God perform these things. They've seen God do great and mighty works, but yet they still don't trust in God, and they question, and they just come and complain to Moses about not having what they need. And so we see in our next passage in Exodus chapter 16, verses 11 through 12. And the Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." So the people were coming, they were hungry, which is understandable, right? They come to God, they're hungry. They come to Moses, they're like, "We're hungry. You should have just left us in Egypt. We would have had plenty of food. We wouldn't have had to do this." Once again, they doubt God. They doubt what God's going to do. And we see this, and Moses comes and he says, God's going to provide. And so God told Moses that he was going to provide them manna during the day, which is bread's going to fall from heaven, and then they're going to provide quails at night for them to eat. So they had plenty of food. And then that lasted for years, God doing that day in, day out. He did it for the first 6 days. On the Sabbath day, they weren't supposed to do it, so they were only to collect the amount they needed later on for each day. So we see that God provides food for them. He provides ways for them. Well, then we move over just literally one chapter over, and we see that, we're not going to read this passage, I'm just going to explain it to you, is we see God providing. He had just provided food for them. They come to them and say, "We're thirsty." Once again, "You should have just left us in Egypt. We would have had water. We wouldn't have had to worry about this." But yet they come to God They come to Moses, and God provides water for them. He tells Moses to go to the rock and to hit the rock with his staff that he hit the water in Egypt, turn it to blood. Hits the rock with his staff. And guess what? Water comes from a rock. Water just doesn't miraculously come from a rock when you hit it with a stick. No, it was only God can do that. So God once again provided something for them. He provided them with what they needed. He provided them with a way to get it. But yet they kept forgetting. They didn't trust in God. They kept wanting to complain. They kept wanting to trust in their own ways. And then the last part of our lesson today, and we'll continue our lesson next week with right after this, is we see that the people of Israel are given the law. They're given how they're supposed to act, how they're supposed to do certain things, and things like that. Probably one of the most popular things that we know as Christians is the Ten Commandments. We're all very familiar with them. We've probably read them many times, and there's a lot of controversy about them sometimes, and being in public places, on courthouses, and places like that. But we see the Ten Commandments, and God gives, not only does He give the Ten Commandments, but He gives the law. He tells them what the priests are supposed to wear, how the tabernacle is supposed to do, all these different things. God sits there and tells Moses on Mount Sinai. So the people of Israel, they come to Mount Sinai, and they're at the bottom, and they're waiting. And that's where we're going to continue our lesson next week. But we see Moses is up there, and Moses is up there a long time, and then we'll see what happens next week. But God provides the law to him, gives him the Ten Commandments, gives him the law, and then Moses is up there for a while. Because if you ever read through this and look at it, it's actually from Exodus 20 to Exodus 31 is Moses being at the top of Mount Sinai. And you read it, and it's very deep, and it's very detailed about what God expects. Things about the Sabbath, the tabernacle, what the priests were supposed to wear, the foods, the sacrifices, all those things are included in there. And so, it's important for us to kind of, understand that, that God had an expectation for His people. God wanted them to follow Him. He wanted them to trust them. And we see that throughout there. God wants us as well to trust Him. We go through things in our lives, and it's not easy for us. We go through difficult times. Maybe we're dealing with sickness, our family's sick, our friends are sick, something, or going through cancer, all these other things that we can go through in our lives. And, we're a lot like the nation of Israel. First time something goes wrong, we just stop and complain. And just like, well, God, you need to do something, you do something. Well, the thing is, God knows what's going on. He can take things and He can do miraculous things. Sometimes we just have to trust Him. Or sometimes, as Josh Peeler mentioned a couple weeks ago in his sermons, sometimes we have to put action to our faith. We have to believe, yes, but there's sometimes things we have to do. And so, as we go throughout this week, let's look for those things that we need to do to maybe take steps of faith, to trust in God, and that realize that no matter what happens, no matter what goes on, that He's there for us and He will provide what we need. We just have to trust in Him and sometimes be patient. Because, what would have happened in the nation of Israel? Maybe if they would have been patient, they would have gotten food. Maybe if they would have been patient, they wouldn't have had to complain about it. Maybe if they would have been patient, they would have gotten water. And they would have had to complain about it. So that's going to end our lesson today. If you have any questions, let me know. But definitely, I want to encourage you to follow along. If you can't come, definitely follow along with this. As the next couple of weeks, we'll start digging into the book of Joshua. So thanks for watching. I hope you have a great day.